Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing spider talk, the amazing spider talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the amazing spider talk.
Hey, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I'm the founder and editor of AmazingSpiderTalk.com, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals. And no one is here to tell me otherwise. Thanks for joining me for a special episode of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. I hope you enjoy this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture. If you want to learn everything I know about Spidey, why not subscribe to the show starting back with the first season? You can enjoy the show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or your podcast player of choice. I'd love to have you along for the journey through Spidey's past, present, and future. Just head on over to AmazingSpiderTalk.com for all the details about where to subscribe. With the holiday season rapidly approaching, I thought it'd be fun to talk to creators who've released books all about the world of Spider-Man. So today, I'm sitting down with Matt Singer, the editor-in-chief of ScreenCrush.com and author of the brand new book, Marvel's Spider-Man, From Amazing to Spectacular, the Definitive Comic Art Collection. Just to note, I was provided a review copy of the book from Insight Comics, but I was thrilled to have Matt Singer on the show. I've been a fan of his work for nearly a decade, both as a podcast host and as a film critic. So I hope you consider checking out his book and that you enjoy our conversation.
Well, now let's meet one of our amazing spider friends, the kind of guy who goes to other friends who recommend. Find out about the things they created. You'll love them so much that you wish you dated. But you're just friends, they're an amazing friend. A friend, a friend, a friend, they're an amazing friend.
Well, welcome back, listeners. I am joined today by Matt Singer. Matt, you are the author of Marvel's Spider-Man, From Amazing to Spectacular, the Definitive Comic Art Collection. First of all, did I get the title right?
I think so. It's a pretty long title, so it's easy to get it wrong. But I think you nailed it.
None of these books are ever succinct on the title. It's always some belabored thing to hit whatever keywords that need to be hit. Did you have any say over that particular titling?
I demanded that the word Spider-Man be in the title, which they graciously agreed to. But other than that, yeah, this was the publisher determined the title. And at different points, it was a slightly different title. I'm not entirely sure how we wound up where we did, but I mean, you get it. I mean, it is an art collection, so the Definitive Comic Art Collection makes sense. I'm not exactly sure where the From Amazing to Spectacular came from, to be honest with you. I don't know who suggested that, and some people who are, people who are really, really into Spider-Man, when they hear that, they go, so is there no Web of Spider-Man in there? Is there no Sensational? And I have to be like, no, everything, as much as we could fit in there is in there. It's not just, it does, if you're a really intense fan, it does kind of sound like it's like the art collection of maybe the first 15 or 20 years or so. But it covers pretty much everything up until like the end of last year, the beginning of this year, 2019.
The words adjectiveless don't really work well in the title.
Right, exactly.
Speaking of the history of the character, I guess I'm curious to get started. I followed you for a number of years and you write a lot of articles about Spider-Man, but like, what's your history with the character? Like, what set him aside for you when you were a kid? Like, this focus on like that guy? Because like, I know when I first started reading it, I didn't understand the kind of full breadth of the character, that he was like a nerd and all this stuff. So despite my own nerdiness, that wasn't necessarily the appeal. So I guess I'm curious, was it that for you? What are your first memories of this guy?
Well, it's interesting you say that because, yeah, like I would certainly describe myself as kind of a nerdy guy, certainly a Peter Parker-esque figure without the, the powers and the bite and the dead uncle and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, my love of the character dates back, to way before I could have been quantified as a nerd, before I knew what a nerd was, before I could even, read. I mean, I loved the character. My parents talk about me being obsessed with the character when I saw him on The Electric Company, this old TV show, which was kind of it's not on anymore, but it was sort of a sister show to Sesame Street, back in the day. It was, I think, made by the same company. It certainly was a PBS show either way, and they would kind of air together. And I watched a lot of Sesame Street, but I also watched a lot of Electric Company. And Spider-Man was like a recurring character. He would have his own segments. And if you've never seen them, they're kind of fascinating. There's some of them are on YouTube. If you just, YouTube and search Spider-Man Electric Company, you'll get them. Spider-Man never talks out loud. He talks in these visible word balloons because it's supposed to be encouraging children to read. And maybe coincidentally, maybe not, I was actually a very early reader. He was kind of there to teach you about reading, and none of the actual villains were on it. The bad guys were very tame. The adventures were very tame. But I don't know, there was something about the character even then. I think maybe the costume. He has this incredible costume that really speaks to children. I know with my own little kids, my older daughter in particular, who's not that old, she's only about 4 now, she loves the costume. She loves Spider-Man just from that. We actually have started reading Spider-Man comics every night, which is really cool. It's really cool for me. We read a different comic every night on our tablet on the Marvel Unlimited app. In fact, we've been reading some really fun ones lately, actually, because I haven't read a ton of the all ages comics because they're, a more recent thing. Not something I've really read for myself all that much, but I really like reading them with my daughter. We're having a lot of fun with it.
So you're not starting with Ditko stuff?
Not really. No, we've looked at the book certainly, and there's a lot of it in there. But when it's, I kind of let her pick, and there's a lot of words in the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko ones. It's not a lot of big, bold pictures, the way that a lot of comics worked back then. It was a lot of, 9 panel grids and 6 panel grids and a lot of words crammed in there. And, as wonderful as Steve Ditko's art can be, it can also be a little, it's sort of a boxier style of art. Sometimes, especially in the early issues, the visually, it's just not quite as dynamic as it would become. And so it's just, and also everyone's dressed from her perspective, everyone's dressed weird. Everyone's wearing sweater vests and suits. And
Peter's kind of a jerk too.
Yeah, exactly. So we stick to more of the Marvel Adventures books, and the various incarnations of that. The last couple of nights we've been reading this book that's called Marvel Adventures Superheroes, which has, at least the issues we've read so far, it's Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the Hulk as a trio, and there's not really an explanation there's no status quo or explanation for how these characters have wound up hanging out together, but they're actually really funny. The one we read tonight, they were out in outer space and they were doing extreme sports with rock aliens, meteor men, and there was a scene where they were doing karaoke. And my daughter loves karaoke. The one time she did it at a wedding, she thought it was the greatest thing ever. So I don't know. They seem to really understand kind of kooky kid logic. They're really fun. I think the issue we read tonight was written by Paul Tobin. It's really, really fun. Definitely if grown-ups with little kids are looking for Spider-Man comics to read with their little ones, that's a good one I can recommend. We've been enjoying it. About an hour ago, we just read that one I was describing, and she was laughing out loud at some of it. So, yeah.
Sounds like some of the crazy Marvel team-up stories that I was used to when I was a kid.
Absolutely. It definitely has a kind of a Marvel team-up vibe, definitely. It's just, there's very little Peter Parker in it at all. They're not worried about, explaining how the characters got together. They're just kind of hanging out. Kids don't care. They don't care how... It's just, it's fun when the Hulk says something goofy and Spider-Man makes a joke. And yeah, it's great for her kind of age. It's perfect.
So you got into the character through the Electric Company. You're doing the hard work of getting your daughter into comics. Maybe not so hard. This book is all about comics. So where did you enter into the world of Spider-Man in comics?
Well, I never really, I mean, once I found him, I was sort of always a fan and, would get comics here or there. My dad was a comic book reader himself when he was a kid. He was born in the 50s, so he was kind of the perfect age for when Marvel really, like the Silver Age was like his wheelhouse. And, he remembers getting Fantastic Four #1 and Amazing Spider-Man #1. And he had a lot of those. Until my grandmother, rest her soul, threw them all away, or most of them away. The couple that he managed to salvage and save, I have now, which is really cool. In fact, there are a couple of Spider-Mans that he gave me, including Amazing Spider-Man #5.
Oh, nice.
A very beat-up copy of Amazing Spider-Man #5 with Dr. Doom.
Right, with the acid on the cover.
Yes, and the other one I'm going to have to look up. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I actually put it in the book almost as a little Easter egg to my dad because it's an issue that I really love, and he gave it to me, and I'm looking it up right now. I can tell you the cover is Spider-Man swinging over this protest.
Oh, the Crisis on Campus one.
Crisis on Campus, exactly. Yeah, that's the caption. I'm not sure if it's 67 or 69. Maybe it's 67. Whichever one it is that says Crisis on Campus, and it's 68. I overshot it and undershot it. Amazing Spider-Man #68. There is a copy of the cover of the Amazing John Romita cover in the book. That's for whatever reason that was one he had and saved, and so he passed that one down to me, and I've always loved that issue, partly nostalgically. So that one is in the book as well.
It even found its way into the Spider-Man PlayStation 4 game.
Is there a Crisis on Campus homage? I played the game, but I don't remember it.
It's very quick, but they recreate the cover of it and blast it on screen for like a half second. It's fun.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't notice that. I was playing it when I have 2 daughters and one of them was a newborn. So some of it I don't remember all too well because I was playing it sort of in a haze of I would have an hour here or there, and I would, instead of sleeping, I would play Spider-Man. So he gave me, anyway, my dad gave me the ones he had, and I would read those, and sometimes I would get copies, like we would go to, if I went with my mom to the grocery store, they would have a spinner rack, maybe I would get a comic here or there. The period that really hooked me was the 30th anniversary issues, which came out in 1962, which each had the holographic covers, or hologram covers, whatever they were. And people have asked me this question, so I've said this answer, but now that I think about it, I don't think I realized until just now, like, I was a big fan of the Marvel trading cards around that time.
That's how I got into it too. The kind of Fleer Ultra and stuff.
Right, exactly. And the first set had these they had like these hologram, like the rare hologram cards, and they looked just like these covers. And now that I think about it, that was probably what made it so appealing to me, was that they looked like those cards. But in any event, my dad, who was a fan, he was like, "Hey, they're doing special issues for the 30th anniversary of Spider-Man. Let's go get them." So we went to we didn't have a comic book store in my area at that time. We had this amazing video store called Easy Video that had a huge comic book section, bigger than some actual comic book stores that I have shopped in, ironically. And they had Amazing Spider-Man 365, which was the 30th anniversary issue for that book, with a David McElhaney and Mark Bagley story with the lizard, which I'm pretty sure became basically the premise of the first episode of the 90s Spider-Man cartoon. Very good story. Nothing mind-blowing, but for some reason I loved that issue. I loved the art, and I read it over and over, and I was just, and obviously that holographic cover was incredibly awesome.
Too bad you couldn't print that in your book.
Yeah, you know what? I really wanted to, but it just didn't look, the hologram just doesn't read. So there's plenty of Mark Bagley artwork in the book, obviously, but yeah, I couldn't sneak that one in there. And then I had basically every issue of Amazing Spider-Man after that for years and years. I still certainly read every issue on that Marvel Unlimited app. I haven't bought the physical issues in a while, just because I do here and there, but it's just too expensive and too hard to get to the store every week with 2 kids. So don't get the physical copies quite as much as I used to or would like, but still reading. But yeah, that period of Spider-Man was the Spider-Man era that kind of hooked me as a obsessive reader, and I pretty much haven't stopped at least reading that's 1992, so that's 27-ish years of pretty careful obsessive reading.
Yeah, my first one was 375, so I was right behind you. Shifting from like our histories, I guess, with this character and stuff, I want to talk about your book. Obviously, that's what you're here for. We discussed the very long title of the book, but like, how would you summarize what this book is for our listeners? Like, what are they getting if they go to pick this thing up?
Well, what they're going to get is, it is basically like a coffee table book. It's very big. That's the number one comment I get from people after they buy it, is that I did not expect it to be this big, because it is really big. It's oversized. It's like, one of the cool things about it is it's way bigger than like an ordinary comic book size. So, you get kind of these beautiful kind of reproductions of the artwork that are even bigger than they were printed originally. So you can really kind of pour over the artwork. And there is quite a bit in it, as the title suggests. And then it's kind of the history of the character. There's a little bit of, because, kind of criticism is sort of my day job and my love. So there's, criticism not in the sense of like, oh, this is bad, this is stinky, I don't like this, but more of the kind of, kind of interpretation, analysis, extrapolation, like kind of drawing connections and looking at the character in a macro sense and trying to understand sort of why he resonates and what it is about the character that makes him so popular. And also why certain storylines are so resonant and why they kind of make sense for the character. And yeah, there's plenty of history of the making of the character as well. I interviewed, I don't know exactly how many creators of Spider-Man, but quite a few, well over a dozen. I talked to Jerry Conway and Tom DeFalco, Brian Michael Bendis, Dan Slott, Danny Fingeroth, Roger Stern, Alex Ross. It's been a while since I talked to these people. David Michelini, who I already mentioned, I talked to. I tried to cram as much of their interviews into the book as I could. DeMatteis, who actually also did the foreword for the book. I spoke to him as well. So yeah, there's interviews, lots of artwork, great overview of the character. I tried to mix it, both the stuff that you have to have in there because that's like the essential famous stuff, and also some of the less famous stuff that's just really good that you want to turn people on to if they haven't read it, or maybe remind them if they've read it but forgot about it. Did my best to kind of, the way I looked at it was, right around the time we were talking about when I was a kid, as a teenager, and really getting into the comics, for my birthday every year, I would get like one of those big history of comics books like Marvel by Les Daniels, or the Marvel Universe by, I think it was by like Peter Sanderson. There was a lot of them. And I would get like one a year, and I would spend like all year like reading it and looking at it. And then I'd get a new one, and then I'd spend that year looking at that one. And back then there really wasn't one like that for Spider-Man, just Spider-Man. Obviously there was Spider-Man stuff in those books, but I always wanted one just for Spider-Man. And so like in my mind, what I set out to do is kind of make the version of one of those books about Spider-Man, like the one that I always wanted as a teenager that I never quite had. So that's sort of the hole in your bookshelf this book kind of would fill, is if you like those kind of books, if you love Spider-Man. I feel like that's kind of the niche I was trying to hit, the sweet spot I was looking for, is to try to be that book in your collection.
I don't want to get into the like hows and the whys that this book happened, because like it's a lot of kind of behind the curtain stuff, but I'm very thankful that you were given the opportunity to do this, because it is so a reflection of like someone who loves the comics. And so I guess I'm curious from you is, there's so much, Spider-Man is such a transmedia property now. It's covering everything from, I guess, like juice drinks to cereal and back again. Was it tempting for your publisher and I guess you to try to include like things like the movies and the cartoons that arguably have a larger audience than the comics?
That's probably a good question for the publisher. I have a feeling some of it has to do with rights, because, as we've seen in the last couple of months, the movie rights to Spider-Man are so complicated, and they're, the character is owned by Disney, but the movie rights are owned by Sony. So perhaps there is some reason that the publisher, which is Inside Editions, isn't even allowed to throw the movies in there. That said, if anyone wanted to make that the sequel book, which is just about Spider-Man movies, Spider-Man cartoons, Spider-Man games, Spider-Man Pop-Tarts, all of it, I would be happy to write that book too, because I love all of that stuff as well. But yeah,
and you'd have to eat all the Pop-Tarts,
which I love Spider-Man Pop-Tarts. They're delicious. I think they're an underrated Pop-Tart, and I'm always excited when they bring them back because they have Spidey berry filling, which is a very real fruit that's quite delicious. I was happy that it was just the comics because I do love the comics, and there is more than enough to cover in a book. I mean, I could have made a book twice as big, twice as long, twice as in-depth as the book you got. The people, some people ask, like, what was the hardest thing about writing this book? And by far, it was just writing the book you see, when I could have easily written twice as much. Cutting things out was just a brutal process, because how do you cut things out? There's so much amazing, no pun intended, amazing Spider-Man to include, and I only had about 190 to 200 pages in there. So when that's all you have to cover 57-ish years of Spider-Man comics, that's not easy. So to me, this book did not need the movies or the games or anything else, as much as I love those things, because just the Spider-Man comics are wonderful enough on their own. They deserve their own book. They deserve multiple books. So I was happy to get to just cover them.
That's one of the beautiful things about reading this book, is seeing you kind of have to condense stories, like explaining the Hobgoblin in a page or explaining the Clone Saga in a page, when I know that you could very well probably do like another 20 pages on who is the Hobgoblin, etc. You're just, I loved reading this and getting to the sentences that were like, yeah, the Hobgoblin, they didn't really solve who that was, and then they did the Hobgoblin Returns years later, and it's like, boy, there is like, endless minutia that could go in there, but you do such a great job of succinctly wrapping it all up. Like, I would feel comfortable handing this book to my wife, say, and letting her understand a little bit more about how this all fits together without having to kind of push up my glasses nerdery of me explaining it to her.
Yeah, it should be, hopefully, if I did my job, it should be clear to people who maybe, let's say, who are most familiar with like the movies and are interested in kind of dipping their toe into the world of the comics. Like, if you have someone in your life who you kind of want to try to get hooked on the comics, I feel like this would be a pretty good gateway drug, so to speak, to the wider world of it. Like, you could kind of hand them this and say, it's a big book, but it wouldn't take you that long to read the whole thing, really. It would give you a pretty good overview. It might give you some places to go to, like, oh, this particular, this Ultimate Spider-Man, that looked pretty interesting. There's like a whole chapter on Ultimate Spider-Man. Maybe I should start with that. Or, oh, I really liked, these Stan Lee, John Romita ones. They look so beautiful. I want to read some of those. Do you have some of those I could borrow? I think that would be that'd be a pretty good use of the book. If there's somebody in your life that sounds like, that you feel like, you catch them looking at your comics or asking questions about Spider-Man, and you want to indoctrinate them in the most pleasant and fun way possible. The book would definitely do that. But you're right. It's not easy to talk about the Hobgoblin in a book like this, because all the different red herrings and identities and retcons and all of that, it's basically impossible. And you also have to keep in mind that by the time the book comes out, there might be a new Hobgoblin, or two different Hobgoblins or 5 Hobgoblins. That was something I also had in my mind, is you didn't want to be too definitive about anything, because who knows, when I started reading comics really obsessively, Norman Osborn was dead, and he'd been dead for decades, but now he's been alive for decades, or maybe he's dead again. Who knows even? So you try to take the long view of it. You try to put these characters and stories kind of into the overall kind of arc of Spider-Man, and like what characters and what concepts have stood the test of time, and which ones were important in their era but maybe haven't quite had the same resonance as others. That was part of the challenge of the book, was how do you get all of this stuff into one book? Well, that was one way I sort of approached it.
But Matt, this is a definitive guide. Come on,
Yeah,
man.
well, as definitive as it can be. Yes.
You said the book is very big, and that's true. I will back that up. But the book is really beautifully assembled. Like, there's a great kind of textured cover on the book and beautiful inside covers and stuff. But the one thing I wanted to ask you about was the cover to the book. It's got this beautifully painted piece by Andrew Robinson. Like, can you tell us about this? Did you have input on the creation of this piece of art?
I did not, but they would sort of keep me in the loop. I would be sort of the dork who was constantly emailing, like, have we gotten it? Is it in yet? You know, because when we first started working on it with the publisher, they had somebody else, and I honestly don't know what happened, but it didn't work out. And then they said, well, we're working with Andrew Robinson, who I love from Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. I love his covers. So I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I can't wait. This is the perfect person. And it did honestly take a little while. Like I remember I kept waiting and waiting to hear, and I would try not to bother the editor and say, have we gotten the cover? Have we gotten the cover? And then I remember she sent me the first like sketch, you know, that I guess was sent along, or the approved sketch maybe, because I did one signing for the book with Andrew at New York Comic Con, and we talked a little bit about the creation of it, and he did go through a couple of versions. They kind of laid out that they wanted, you know, what you'll see on the cover, you know, they wanted a kind of a tableau with a lot of the cast. I guess he said at one point that they had told him, or there was maybe some confusion about like different characters to include, so he had to do different versions. But then the version that he did, that's the final cover that you see. I remember when I got the sketch, they sent me, the editor was nice enough to send me the sketch for, you know, and just say like, you know, what do you think? I was like, oh man, this is amazing. And I absolutely love the cover. I am a little biased here, but I think it's really the perfect artwork for the book. When I saw Andrew at the convention, when I did the signing with him, he was selling the original artwork. And the actual painting of it was so even more gorgeous in person, and I wished I could have afforded to buy it. I did get a print of it and had him sign it, and that's actually hanging in my house now. So that's one of the coolest things about writing this book is having in any way been associated with that piece of artwork. It's really, really cool. Yeah, it's pretty great.
It's also a big deal to have someone like J.M. DeMatteis do an introduction to your book. Can you talk about how that came together and why you chose him of all people to be the guy that introduced your book?
Well, the editor and I had talked about a couple of different people, but when I did my interview with him, he was like, I don't know if he was the most enthusiastic, because actually everyone I spoke to was so great. The creators that I spoke to were so generous with their time, and you know, I feel like Spider-Man is, you know, like the character himself, you know, we haven't really talked about him that much, but, you know, like one of the things that I love about him is that Spider-Man is like a mensch, you know, like he's the ultimate good guy, you know, and you do, when you talk to a lot of the people that made him, you see where his values and his kind of like his morality comes from, because all the people that created him are mensches too. Like they're just great guys. They're great men and women to talk to, and they're so generous, and they have this really kind of, I don't know, they're just really giving of themselves. And, you know, and I would just say what I was doing. They'd be like, yeah, let's do it. Let's talk. So, and JM was like particularly like just generous and forthcoming, and had these great answers for everything, and would give me more than I asked him for. And so it was just like, maybe he'd be the right person to do the foreword. And that was it. He did it. And he did a fabulous job. And yeah, another kind of pinch me moment for a Spider-Man dork is to like write a book with him doing the foreword, and, you know, the cover. It's pretty awesome all around, really. I mean, don't tell the publisher I said this, but I would have done this for free. So the fact that I did get paid a little bit to do it was pretty good.
JM was one of the first guests we ever had on the show. So like he's always been very generous to us. And I was pleased to see him, you know, doing this intro for you, which is very well written and very kind, I felt.
Yeah, he's awesome.
You know, the book itself, like you mentioned earlier, is broken into chapters that kind of separate out the history of Spider-Man. Like you said, it was hard to kind of limit it down. Is there an era of Spider-Man comics in particular that you feel like, oh boy, if I could kind of really dive into that era a bit more, I wish I could have?
God, it's hard to pick one, because I could have, like I said, I could have written, you know, twice as long a book with each chapter being twice as long as it is. I do kind of wish I could have gotten to do another. I mean, I'm ready to write like the update about, kind of what's been going on lately a little bit. I mean, I'm a little behind because I'm mostly reading on the Marvel Unlimited app, so I'm a few months behind, but I kind of cut things off with the end of Dan Slott's run, which is a really kind of perfect place to end things, just because, I don't know, his run feels so classical in a lot of ways, with certainly plenty of, interesting surprises and twists like Superior Spider-Man and all of that stuff. But the way it ends is kind of a very nice capper for a book like mine, when it ends with like Amazing Spider-Man 801 is such a beautiful kind of love letter to Spider-Man. That's a really nice place to end a book that's also a love letter to Spider-Man. There's a little kind of conclusion of the book, and the last image of that issue is one of the last issues in the book. There's that, and there's a really lovely Steve Ditko panel that's like a lot of Steve Ditko's early issues especially end with a very similar issue of like Peter Parker walking off into the distance alone, sadly, or kind of contemplative, with like Spider-Man's image kind of looming over him. And so that's on the end of the book too. But yeah, all the stuff that like Nick Spencer's been doing, and the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man book I think is fantastic. I would love to have gotten to throw those in there. And some of the stuff that's happened to Peter and Mary Jane feels like it would, it already feels a little bit like the book's already starting to get out of date, which breaks my heart. Oh, God, that I can't kind of, there's no appendix or, addition or postscript or something. Maybe I should just write that on my own and put it online. I feel like I kind of need to do that. Just talking about it is making me itchy and uncomfortable that there's new stuff covered.
Right. He's gonna undo one more day, and you're not gonna be able to have it in your book.
I know, it's gonna be brutal. The other thing would be, there's a chapter, kind of the last full chapter in the book is about, it's like a Spider-Verse chapter, and it does deal with the Spider-Verse comics, but it also has kind of a rundown of all the different Spider-Verse characters or Spider-Man offshoot characters. So anyone who's kind of got spidery powers, and it starts way back with Spider-Woman, the Jessica Drew Spider-Woman, and I tried to include as many characters as I could. A lot of those characters, I for sure could merit and even deserve a lot more time. I gave Spider-Gwen a sidebar. Miles certainly has a lot of real estate in that chapter, but that chapter could be 3 or 4 times as long, just getting into all the different characters. There's some like Spider-Man 2099 I loved as a kid, and he's certainly in there, but I could have written more about him. Spider-Ham is in there, which I love, but there's a lot going on in the whole Spider-Verse, Spider-Geddon. That whole kind of world is getting bigger and bigger all the time. I crammed as much as I could in, but again, like Spider-Geddon is another thing that was it had kind of just started as I had to finish the book, so I couldn't really include it. Characters like Spider-Man and Spiders Man. I love every weird character in those books. I adore. I think they're so creative and clever and funny, and I would happily put every single one in the book if I could.
So these interviews that you did, they really span, like every chapter like checks in with nearly everybody that you interviewed, which was really impressive. So like, I'm curious how you kind of conducted these interviews so that you like knew you could get all these different topics. Did you kind of like shotgun it? Like you're like, I'm going to spray everywhere with each person and see what I can get?
Yes. It was mostly a matter of putting together the dream list of who I would want to talk to, and, like the list, and like consulting with the editor and with Marvel, who, kind of had the final say on the finished book and everything, and just trying to get as many of them to talk as I could. And there were certainly some that it just didn't work out, and, some that I had, just couldn't quite make it into the book, but did my best to get as many people as I could. And yeah, as many eras of Spider-Man creators as I could as well. Stan Lee passed away just before I got the job, which is a bummer, because man, if wouldn't that have been cool? I did get to interview him once years and years ago when I was working for IFC. I interviewed him at E3, the video game convention. He was there hyping I think it was Ultimate Alliance or one of the Ultimate Alliance games. And for whatever reason, he was there, just doing a public appearance and signing autographs. And, he was not exactly up on the game itself, really. But, he was Stan Lee. It was fantastic. He was just in character and he was so funny. And it was great that I got to do it. Yeah, I would have loved to have, talked to him for the book. But that was not meant to be. But I like you said, there's a very nice range. So there's people. There's interviews in every single chapter, pretty much. Multiple interviews in a lot of chapters. Sometimes people giving their different interpretations of what was happening at the time. But that's part of the fun. But yeah, it was definitely a shotgun approach. I think is probably a good way to describe it. It was as far and wide as I could cast my net as possible, and pretty much everyone who I spoke to is in the book in some shape or form. I mean, I would have loved to. Some of these interviews were 2 and 3 hours long. I would have loved to have, I was sitting there going, God, I wish I had a way to use all of this. I would have, wanted to just put transcripts in the book if I could have, because there was so much good stuff. But that was, again, just cutting things out was the biggest challenge and heartbreaker.
Well, I really enjoyed the information that we got out of Alex Ross in your book, because he doesn't really do a lot of interviews. And I thought that the kind of tidbits that he gave you on the original design of Spider-Man's costume and how he was updating it, I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, that was really cool. I was able to get in touch with him. I don't have a ton of artists in the book, which for whatever reason, the artists are harder to track down. They are, or maybe they're just busier because they're all drawing all the time, and they don't have time to talk to a yokel like me, which I totally understand. If you're going to talk to one person about sort of the Spider-Man, like kind of the design, I mean, he's a great guy to talk to because you could tell when you talk to him too, like he's really thought about it. It's not just like, oh, it's a cool costume. It's really attractive. Like he can explain to you why, from a design perspective. And I don't want to just kind of tell you what he said because that's kind of part of the fun of reading the book. But like he can explain like why children do connect with this character and why, the Ditko original design still works and what makes it special. And it has to do with proportions and the shape of the face and the shape of the eyes and the different ways that the colors in the costume, kind of play off of each other. And then he talked about the redesign that he did for the end of the Dan Slott run. He talked about, because I actually thought his version of the costume was really cool. I really liked that kind of update. So we talked about, how he approached redesigning it. And he said, like, you can't, it's like trying to improve the Mona Lisa or whatever. Like he didn't want to change it too much. It wasn't a radical reinvention. But I actually even told him how much I loved the costume in that Spider-Man game. I even mentioned that I was like really excited to see it in the game. And I know when I was playing the game, that was one of my kind of go-to costumes. I would change the costumes all the time because that was one of the cool things about that game. But the Alex Ross Spider-Man costume was one of my go-tos that I spent a lot of the game in because it looked so cool. I actually think it almost looked cooler in the game than it did in a lot of the comics. Because in the comics, a lot of the times, it kind of... on his covers, they really nailed the kind of like metallic sheen. Like he knew exactly what he was going for. And certainly when you're doing like a painting and, like one a month, it's probably easier to get the detail and really capture the texture of it. But sometimes in the interior, as cool as it looked, it also kind of looked like a spandex costume with like a glowy light on the chest. But in the game, it really looked like armor. It really looked like it had like kind of the metallic kind of quality to it, which really made it look really, really cool.
I was never a huge fan of it in the comics, but you're right. I played with it constantly in the game. It was like...
it looked awesome in the game. It looked so cool.
It was more like Iron Man than the Iron Spider suit was in a weird way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
So one of the interesting things about reading an overview summary of Spider-Man's comic history like you've written is that you kind of start to spot trends in the storytelling. One that you've highlighted the most here is the desire for creators to reboot the character of Spider-Man to get him back to his origins and what made him popular. I could ask you a ton of questions about this subject, but I guess I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think this kind of backwards looking desire is something that the character will ever escape? And do you think that this kind of quest by these writers and editors to revert the character has hurt him in the long term?
I don't know that I see it so much now, but I mean, well, it's interesting. This is a complicated answer because right when I was starting to read, and I guess you were starting to read too, like that was the number one, almost like publishing directive, it seems, was Spider-Man has gotten too old. He's too mature. He doesn't reflect our audience, which is ironic because the audience for comics has gotten older and older and older. We need to figure out a way to make him seem younger. And from like 1990 on, for a long time, it was like every single thing that happened to Spider-Man in a macro sense, not every individual issue, but like the kind of impetus behind a lot of the events and the new kind of when a new creative team would come on or a new publishing initiative would happen, it was always about how do we simplify? How do we bring him back to his roots? How do we make this more accessible? How do we get back to the core of the character? Even something as absurdly and convolutedly complicated as the Clone Saga, like grew out of an idea of we need to simplify Spider-Man, which is so ironic because the Clone Saga is maybe the most convoluted and ridiculous storyline ever. As much as I like parts of it, like it became so incredibly just bogged down in continuity and minutia and these characters and decades of stories. But the idea, when you boil it down, was could we maybe replace Spider-Man with a younger single version of Spider-Man? Like, can we get rid of Peter Parker and can we replace him with Ben Reilly, at least in the short term, who's a single guy, who's not married, who doesn't have all these responsibilities, who's maybe not quite as morose or depressed as Spider-Man was? Like, because I don't know that people remember, if they're not reading those books, how kind of sullen Spider-Man had gotten by that point. He was like more spider than man. Like that was kind of the shtick that they were doing for a while. That was like right when you started reading, like the parents, they brought back the parents and they killed off the parents. They weren't real parents. They were, I don't know exactly what they were. They were
androids.
New androids, but they were created by the Chameleon, but they were also created by the Green Goblin or whatever. So as you might expect, and it's very fair, if your parents came back, your long lost parents came back, and then they were androids, you might be pretty depressed too after that. But Spider-Man was like, Peter was like really depressed about that, and so like the solution was Ben Reilly, but obviously that became more of a problem, or the solution created more problems than it solved. Really, you name it, and that was an attempt to de-age the character or find a way back to the roots of the character. Ultimate Spider-Man is another perfect example. Brand New Day was another example. And you're right, it just keeps happening over and over. Is it good for the character or bad for the character? I don't know. I think what's probably best for the character is to not repeat oneself, which I guess in a way when you're returning the character to his roots, you are kind of repeating yourself. I think I sort of enjoy, I guess what you have to do is when you're reading these comics is you kind of have to look at it as a cyclical thing. Spider-Man always does kind of return to his roots. He also has these wild, digressions and these weird, interesting variations. Dr. Octopus takes over his body for a year or two. So the Spider-Verse happens. Ben Reilly happens, and then invariably everything kind of goes back to normal-ish. There are things that change, characters grow, they evolve, and the good stuff kind of sticks around and the bad stuff kind of goes away. Like that's kind of the way it works. So to me, I think it's fun to see the classic version of the character. I enjoy the classic version of the character, and I enjoy in certain doses when the character does kind of go back to a classical version of the character. But I also really love when writers get to see how elastic the character can be. And if anything, the last couple of years have shown me just how elastic the concept is and how fun it can be to see the character do different things. Like I really loved the Doc Ock Superior Spider-Man run, actually. I thought that was really fun. And I loved when Peter Parker came back and he was like Tony Stark for a while and he was running his own company. I thought that was really fun. And then I loved when he kind of went back to being the guy who works at the Daily Bugle or is, trying to figure out where he belongs in the world. I do sort of love seeing all the different variations. And I think maybe that is the healthiest thing for the character, is to just constantly evolve. Sometimes maybe to evolve in a way that reminds us of the good old days, but always sprinkling in some new wrinkles, new characters, new villains, new variations. Should never be, exactly how it was, but there's nothing wrong with maybe, reminding us of the classics now and then.
That's what I found so curious about reading your book over the past few days. It's just this kind of repetition on this theme, because even in the past couple of years, we've seen Spider-Man, I think, kind of grow a little bit older, right? We've got Into the Spider-Verse, where we saw an older version of him. The character in the comic has become a legacy character, right? Miles can kind of be the young guy now. And in the comics, they've brought Mary Jane back as his girlfriend, and they're starting to lean into the One More Day stuff with this Kindred villain. And I almost wonder if, we seem to be swinging the other way. Have we finally broken this spell and Miles Morales was the solution, and Spider-Man can finally start to be a little bit older? I just feel like reading your book highlighted that for me, and I thought it was really interesting.
There are so many different Spider-Man family characters, for lack of a better term, that you're right. There is kind of a Spider-Man or woman or girl or ham for any reader. And you're right, with younger characters like Miles, you can let Peter Parker be a little bit older. And again, like I was saying before, I don't know the average age of a Marvel reader, but I would guess it's probably closer to the dad bod Spidey of Into the Spider-Verse than it is the 16-year-old geek from Amazing Fantasy number 15 or whatever. I think for sure there is a place for an older Spider-Man character, an older Peter Parker. I enjoyed the Renew Your Vows series kind of for that reason. When I was growing up, when I was reading those 90s comics that were really hooking me, Peter Parker and Mary Jane were married, and it didn't seem weird to me. I mean, people talk about, well, why is Peter Parker married? Why he's the consummate kind of single guy, the loser, the this, that, the other. And I don't know, it didn't bother me. I liked it. I liked the idea, because Spider-Man at that age to me was a very aspirational character. So the idea that you could grow up and the geek could be the guy that, found this wonderful relationship, that was appealing to me. So I think, I've always liked Peter and Mary Jane, and I loved the idea of them having a daughter who is a superhero as well. I mean, when you have daughters, it's a very appealing idea, I suppose. But, I've read a little of that book with my daughter too, and we definitely enjoy that concept as well. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we have broken that cycle a little bit. I guess that's the kind of thing that only time will tell, because these things do have a way of seeming like they're headed in one direction, and they are for a year or two, and then invariably things change again.
So the book's title advertises it as the definitive guide to the art. So I guess really quickly to talk about the art, like you said, the thing that was really exciting for me was seeing this book is almost like a treasury edition for every comic you've ever loved in the Spider-Man run. I have to imagine I don't know what the kind of business deal here is, but I imagine it cost a fair deal to kind of get all of these images and print them as such. Were there limitations and goals for you in particular in regards to the artwork you included?
The book is published by Insight Editions. It's not published by Marvel, but it's sort of licensed from Marvel. So, and the goal was always it's going to be an art book and part art, part history. So it wasn't really like a matter of we can only afford X, Y, or Z. It was more of we only have this many pages and how many great pieces of artwork can we fit in here. The way that the art was kind of done was, as I was doing the research for the book, which was just reading and rereading hundreds of books, I would just keep lots of notes on stuff that I loved, stuff that, again, kind of like what I was saying earlier, it's like the stuff that has to be in there, like lifting the giant debris off of his back in the classic Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, saving Aunt May kind of stuff. And then just trying to find some interesting, things that aren't maybe as famous or as iconic, but are really fun or beautiful or unique or whatever it might be. The editor and I, pretty much, we each kind of made our own lists and then kind of combined them and said, well, we need this, we definitely need this, we need more of this, we don't have enough of this person, we want more of this person. And that was really it. And just, again, trying to get as wide a range as we could, in terms of the eras, the eras was, and the periods in the book, the chapters was the first thing I did was the outline. So then you outline, each chapter and also the stories you're hoping to cover in there. And you also have to keep that in mind. So if I'm writing about the Clone Saga, I've got to make sure I have I've got to make sure I've got the artwork that reflects what I'm writing. In the Spider-Verse chapter, if I'm talking about Spider-Man 2099, well, I got to make sure I've got a great representative image or two of him, or Spider-Woman, or Spider-Gwen, or Spider-Girl, or the other Spider-Girl, or the other Spider-Girl, or whoever it might be. That's the other thing, too, is like logistically, like, do I have enough images of Dr. Octopus? Do I have enough images of the Sinister Six? Do I have enough images of Hobgoblin? Do I have enough Green Goblin? Do I have enough, do I have any of this person? Like, oh my gosh, do I have this, all those sorts of things. Again, it's a lot of research and then, like space management and making sure you do your best to get as much of a variety of artists and characters in there.
You mentioned that you put in Amazing Spider-Man 68 as like kind of like a nod to your father. Are there any other images in the book that you're like especially proud of including?
Yeah, I told you that one's I think I maybe told one or two other people in interviews, but yeah, the Amazing Spider-Man 68 was definitely like my Easter egg to myself or to my dad. I mean, it's a great piece. It's an amazing cover, but it's definitely one that I have a lot of nostalgic feelings towards. I'm trying to think. I mean, I tried not to do that too much. I tried to really let the artwork speak for itself and to pick ones that I thought were particularly, appropriate for whatever we were doing.
I love that you included, for example, the Buckingham image from the Mets game. Like that, like that to me was like, that one's personal, as someone who used to live in New York for a while, like that always takes me back to like living in New York. And I thought that was a special inclusion.
I guess that's true. Perhaps a Mets fan would not include an issue of Peter Parker and Uncle Ben going to a Mets game and learning life lessons through the tragedy of being a Mets fan. You're right. That I have to be honest and say that someone who was not a Mets fan, as I am, might not include that in their Spider-Man book. But that is a great issue. I really love the Paul Jenkins and Buckingham run of Peter Parker Spider-Man, or I guess it started there and maybe it went to Spectacular Spider-Man at one point. It might have had a few different titles, that book. I always love that run. It's so kind of low-key and really based in the characters. You're right, I did throw that in there. Uncle Ben has some wonderful speeches in that issue about why losing is okay. And if you're a Mets fan, you learn that losing is okay. And Spider-Man is a guy who has learned to live with loss. That's part of what makes him Spider-Man, is that he does sometimes lose. He doesn't always save everyone. And so the way that Paul Jenkins found a way to kind of mesh those philosophies felt not only realistic, but it just very touching, very, very plausible for that character, that they would be Mets fans. Plus, they live in Queens. I mean, come on, it only makes sense. So, yeah, you're right. I cannot lie. You're right. That was one that I threw in there, perhaps out of a personal affection. But I think it fits. It works.
I mean, I pointed out only because I love that run, too, so much, and it's so overlooked. And as one of the best runs of Spider-Man. And so seeing then that I was like, good, someone's actually acknowledging, the amazing work that those two did together. So speaking of kind of overlooked things, I kind of asked you coming on here today if you like had any comics that you felt like you wanted to champion, like maybe overlooked classics that like straight out of the brain of Matt Singer, like something that you really enjoy that you feel like people should go check out. I guess I'm curious, drum roll. Let's do your list. Do you have some for us?
Sure. I mean, actually that era I think is a great era to kind of champion, and it really dovetails nicely with what we were talking about in terms of Peter Parker kind of, the urge to make him younger. And I feel like that era, not just the Jenkins Spider-Man, but also what Straczynski was doing an Amazing Spider-Man at the same time. Like, that's one of the few periods where they actually let Peter Parker feel a little older, and they didn't try to make him younger. I guess they just realized, well, we have some amazing writers and artists. Why don't we let like the fact that they're going to make amazing comics like be the selling point? And it was. Those books sold pretty well for a long time. To me, like, I reread hundreds and hundreds of Spider-Man books. I really enjoyed rereading a lot of them. Some were as good as I remembered. Some were better than I remembered. And I really thought this period, as much as I enjoyed reading it at the time, I thought it was even better than I remembered. I did not remember that when the Straczynski run starts, Peter and Mary Jane are separated, like an actual marital separation. And that stuff is like really mature. They're like, the way that their relationship is written is really beautiful. And I love all the stuff. That's the period where Aunt May finds out that he is Spider-Man, that Peter is Spider-Man, and they have that issue-long conversation. I'm a sucker for any Spider-Man comic where two characters just sit in a room and talk the whole time. I love that. I love the Ultimate Spider-Man where Peter tells Mary Jane he's Spider-Man. That's another favorite of mine. I think that in that era, obviously by the end of it, it got bigger. There were storylines. There was, there were some big storylines with villains. And honestly, some of those were the weakest parts of that era. But when you had those guys, Jenkins and Buckingham and Straczynski and mostly Romita Jr., like all like kind of just doing like really good, like small scale, like character stuff and growing the characters and their relationships, I loved rereading those books, and I think they hold up really well. And it's kind of a timeless era of Spider-Man, actually. And like the supporting casts are tiny. It's really just Peter and Aunt May and Mary Jane for a lot of it. And I guess Uncle Ben is kind of the ghost hanging over the Jenkins run, because he's discussed, or he's in a lot of those books and flashbacks and scenes like that. But it's really kind of nice too to like have this really, it's like a pure distilled Spider-Man in a sense, because there's not too much of the Daily Bugle and Empire State University and all those people who are great. I love the supporting cast too, but it's kind of awesome to have this really intense, like almost like Spider-Man melodrama going on in those books. So that would probably be one that I would highlight for sure as like, I honestly don't know whether I have no idea, and these things change. I don't know whether those books are considered masterpieces or not at this point. I really don't know. I know they ended on a way that left a lot of people with kind of a sour taste in their mouth. So I honestly don't know whether they're beloved or not. But if you haven't read those in a while, that was a situation where like I had a very tight turnaround on this book, and I did not have time to read everything. And I didn't have time to read stuff that wasn't going to wind up in the book, or, sometimes I would get enough that I would be like, okay, I can move on. I can write about this. And I just found myself, I kept reading more and more of those books because they were just so fun. I didn't want to stop. So that would be my first pick for sure.
We did a whole episode on the Doomed Affairs issue where it's like Peter and Mary Jane reuniting at the airport, and how much we love that issue, even though Dr. Doom seems like a weird add-on. But yeah, there's that. You mentioned that issue, and then the conversation with Aunt May. Like, those are just incredible melodramatic pieces. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, they're wonderful. So that would be one. And then I think another one that I would definitely pick out, and it has a little sidebar in the book because I love it so much. And those sidebars that are in the book were kind of things that I basically begged my editor to let me do, basically because I had so much stuff to cover. Like I've said, like one way that I found to cram more stuff in was like, well, let me do some sidebars where I just kind of talk for a page or two outside of the main kind of narrative and history I'm writing about something. And so that was how I snuck in some extra stuff that I loved. And one of the things that has a sidebar in the book is Untold Tales of Spider-Man, which is a book that I really love. And again, another example of them trying to find a way to make Spider-Man younger again. But they did it in a way that I thought was really clever and unique, in that it was an attempt not to erase things that had happened or undo things that had happened, but to add on to what already existed. So the idea was, and I'm sure most of your listeners know Untold Tales of Spider-Man, but like it was this book that also was really special at the time because it was 99 cents when most comics were, probably by that point, they were probably $2, maybe $1.50 if you were lucky, but mostly $2. And it was 99 cents an issue, which for a kid at the time was amazing because you could actually afford more comics for 99 cents.
I can't imagine them doing that today. Like it
seems hard. I know it's very hard to imagine when, especially now that comics are like, the cheap comics are like $4, which is, you know, it was very expensive. So, you know, just imagine, I guess the equivalent would be like, just imagine if there was a monthly book coming out now that was like $2 a month. It's like unheard of, but that's how this book was. Just a fabulous book. It was basically set in between the original issues of the Lee and Ditko run, and it was imagining like sort of these extra adventures that we had never seen before. You know, like the title says it all, it was the Untold Tales of Spider-Man, and it was Kurt Busiek and Pat Olive was the artist, and I just loved that book. I think the whole thing is really, really fun. They would introduce they had some new villains. They would do, you know, classic villains sprinkled in. There's a really awesome annual that I put the cover by Mike Allred is in the book. It's like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. And I think it's like Spider-Man and the Invisible Woman go on a date. And it's very awkward and uncomfortable. That's a really, really fun book. I'm pretty sure the whole thing is in the Marvel Unlimited app. If you've never read it, it holds up really nicely. They managed to kind of capture the flavor of the old books without it feeling super old-fashioned.
I could look at Pat Olive's Spider-Man all day. He's like the one artist I feel like never got the fair shake on doing amazing.
He's really, really good. And he does kind of capture the flavor of the Ditko style, but without it being kind of slavishly devoted to it. It's his own thing. It's very recognizable as his work if you know his work. I don't know if there's trade paperbacks of it, and if there are, I don't know if it's as cheap as it should be based on the fact that the original issues were only 99 cents. But I know they're on the Unlimited app because I read a bunch of them again when I was doing the book, and yeah, I still love that series a lot.
There's a giant out-of-print hardcover of it that you can get. We gave it away as a prize a couple of years ago on the show. It'll cost you more than $1 an issue for sure.
Oh, that's too bad.
Do you have a third one you want to champion?
Sure, yeah. One more that I guess I would single out as a run that I didn't actually know all that well before I did the book, and then doing the book and reading the issues again and reading some of the issues for the first time. I really appreciated them. You know, because there are these eras that become very famous, like, you know, all the stuff by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and John Romita and Conway and Andrew. And, you know, there's so many eras that are like, you know, very famous. One that I don't think anyone ever told me, oh, you have to read the Tom DeFalco, Ron Frenz Spider-Man.
I was so hoping you were going to say that.
You have to read those books. They're so great. I don't think anyone in my life ever once said that to me. And so when I read those books for this book, for writing my book, you know, I read them mostly, you know, to be completist, and also because there's a lot of important stuff in terms of, you know, the black costume and the alien costume and Venom, and that chapter of the book is very Venom focused. And so I wanted to, you know, read those books again. And what I found was, separate from the costume, which is in there and is important, like, those are really good Spider-Man comics, very like classical in terms of Peter is kind of down on his luck and he's got all this stuff going on, and, you know, between dropping out of school and, you know, it comes right after the Roger Stern run, which is so famous. And I did have people tell me, well, you have to read Roger Stern's Spider-Man, and those are fantastic. They're wonderful. And I actually had, you know, just growing up, like I had collected all the original issues of that, you know, finding them in dollar bins and going to conventions and stuff back before there was a Marvel Unlimited app to read them all on. That's, you know, that's how old I am. There weren't really even trade paperbacks of most of those books at that time. But I never really went back and had most of these DeFalco and Friends issues. I think I probably had, you know, their first issue, which is, I think, 252, I think, the one that's, you know, like introducing the new Spider-Man, you know. I'm pretty sure I got that one at some point for a couple of bucks at a convention. But I don't think I had every issue. In fact, I know I didn't have every issue, and I still don't. And so reading those, I was like, wow, this is like a kind of a great unappreciated run of Spider-Man. And, they're the ones who really deserve the credit for really kind of making Mary Jane the character who she still kind of is today. They're the ones who kind of introduced that. I think when I interviewed even Tom DeFalco about his work, I think he might have called it this, like a secret identity almost, that she has her own secret identity, that she was always depicted as, kind of the party girl, the carefree one. She was like the contrast to Gwen Stacy, who was more serious and the more serious student. And they were the ones who kind of gave her this really interesting backstory that, kind of mirrors Peter's backstory and gives her kind of a secret identity the same way that he has one. And she reveals that she's always known he's Spider-Man. They're the ones who threw that in there.
You're speaking about the great issue, Amazing Spider-Man 259, the All My Past Remembered.
Yeah.
You like these melodrama stories. They're like walking through the park and
I love it. I love it. You're right. I keep coming. It's like I'm not even realizing it. Those are like the ones that really get singled out for me. I love that. I love that issue, and I love that entire run. I think it's a really, really solid run. And again, like when you're talking about runs that don't get talked about, because pretty much, right before them gets talked about a lot, right after them gets talked a lot. But those issues, because I guess maybe because other than the Mary Jane stuff and other than the costume stuff, it's not like a lot of really momentous life events happen. But I just think they have a really great Peter Parker. They have a great handle on the character. He's funny in those issues. And Ron Frenz's artwork is really wonderful. He's another underrated artist as well. So that's another run that I would definitely single out as worthy of a reread or a first read. If you haven't read those books, they're pretty great.
Well, Matt, I loved reading your book. I love following all your work online. So if our listeners at home want to buy your book and follow you online, how would they do so?
The book, thank you. That's very kind. And I definitely listened to some of this podcast as I was doing my research for the book. It was useful as well, and just fun. It was just fun to hear your interviews with some of these people. That was awesome too. So thank you. The book is on sale online, anywhere you could think to find it. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can get it. It's in previews. Like it has a previews code if you want to get it through your local comic book store. It's available that way. But I mean, pretty much any place online that sells books, you can find it. And if you just want to follow me online, my Twitter account is @MattSinger. My day job is as the editor of a website called Screen Crush, where I'm mostly writing about movies. I try to sneak in the comics anywhere I can. So there's a lot of writing about superhero movies and comic book movies, certainly. It's mostly movies and TV over there, but definitely anytime I get to write about Spider-Man is a good day, which happens sometimes, which is nice. Or some of the other Marvel or DC characters as well. But yeah, that's it.
Well, cool. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about Spider-Man. I could talk about Spider-Man forever. I happily would write another 10 books about Spider-Man. It just he's a character that never gets old. I mean, obviously, you're doing this podcast for however many years. However many hours upon hours. I mean, you get it. You understand.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, you understand better than most people do. And I'm sure everyone who's listening understands as well. So, yeah, he's just pretty much the best fictional character, the most wonderful. If there's a better one out there, that I certainly haven't encountered him or her yet. So, yeah, it's just a pleasure to get to talk to you about him.
Well, Matt, we'll have to have you back for a regular episode of the show.
I would love that anytime.
Thank you again to Matt Singer for joining me to talk about his new book, Marvel's Spider-Man, From Amazing to Spectacular, the definitive comic art collection. And thank you to you, the listener, for joining us for this conversation. Please consider checking out Matt's book. I have placed a link to where to purchase the book in the episode's description for you to enjoy. Also, for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast player this week for a special review of Amazing Spider-Man number 35. There's no better place to join on the Patreon bandwagon than to join us for our exciting coverage of the Nick Spencer run. Remember, for just $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic book, you'll get access to our exclusive new issue reviews, B-book reviews, extended interviews, mailbags, and more. And for $10 or more a month, you'll get access to some awesome commissioned artwork this season from Barry Kitson. Also, be sure to check out our sister show, The Untold Talks of Spider-Man. Plus, we've also got the amazing Spider Slack community for you to join. Just check out this episode's description for a link to join our Spider-Man Talkin' community. And a special thank you to Rick Coste, our amazing, spectacular, adjectiveless web of editor who cut together this very episode. Rick, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, where we can find your work, and what you think about Matt's new book?
Thanks, Dan. This is Rick, and you can find my work at modernaudiodrama.com, where all of my shows are located, or you can also go to rickcoste.com to find some of my other projects. And the book that we're just discussing in this episode, while I was editing the episode, I was so impressed I went out and bought the book myself. It's beautifully done, full of amazing artwork, commentary, articles. I highly recommend it. And as of this recording, there's still plenty of time to go out and buy it for your favorite Spider-Man fan. And I would be remiss if I don't mention Mark's book as well. Both books would look great under the Christmas tree. Happy holidays. Thanks, Dan. Back to you.
Awesome. Thanks again, Rick. If you want to follow me on social media, you can check out my Twitter account at SupSpiderTalk. But I'd be remiss if I didn't issue a special recommendation from my friend and co-host Mark Ginocchio. If you're looking for another book to pick up this holiday season, why not check out his book, 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. I've got a link to that book in the show notes. It's super cheap, helps Mark and the show out, and is stuffed full of a ton of Spider-Man knowledge that we bring to the show each week. It'd mean a ton to us if you check it out. But mostly, I want you all to remember that with great podcasts, there must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.